So welcome everyone in person and online to the Coastal Monitoring Historical Coastal Change final dissemination event. It's a pleasure actually being here after 2 years of running the project. First, let me kind of acknowledge who has been the participants and the promoters of this work. So this is a work that has been funded and initiated by Natural Resource Wells and Defra, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. You see the long list of participants that we've been part of the team that did the work. I'll have an acknowledgement section at the end. I'll show you the names and the roles of everyone. But with this one, I just want to welcome you to the event and kind of explain what you will see in the next 2 hours or so. So as you probably have seen already, this is going to be a video recorded session because it's going to be disseminated after the event, both in the BGS YouTube channel and through Defra. So it is video recorded. My name is Andres Payo. I am the principal coastal scientist here in BGS. I'm also the project manager of the project. And I was leading one of the tasks, in particular, the one developing the methodology. So what will happen today is quite straightforward. So you will see a series of speakers that are, some of them are with me on the room, some of them are online. I will start giving you an overview of the whole project so you get a feeling of everything we've been doing. There is no time in 2 hours to condense everything we've been doing in 2 years. So what we'll give you is a glimpse of what we've done, give you a point towards where more information can be found, and you will have at the end the opportunity to ask some questions. But let me introduce the speakers first. So you will have, after I go through the overview, you will have like a lessons learned from the different tasks. And in particular, we will start with James Sutherland from HRWallingford, who will give us an insight on the lessons learned on the rapid evidence assessment. So what has been done already. Then, as also part of the rapid evidence assessment, Paul Sawyers will give us a flavor of what can we say about how communities has changed over time, coastal communities. And then Vanessa Banks from BGS will tell us what science, looking at the peer review publication, what science can contribute to the task that we've been doing all together. Then, before I pass the word to the next speaker, you will see my face again, because I'm going to be talking about one of the tasks, task 2, that is on the monitoring approaches. And then I will pass to Chris Hill, who is from Southampton University, GeoData Institute, who will give you an overview of the adaptable methodology and the platform, and will be followed up by Andy Murdoch from Maploom, who will actually demonstrate the prototype that we have developed all together. So that will be all of us. We have 10 minutes roughly, each one of the speakers, so to give you some food for thought. And then we will be joined by Kyle Gormley, which has been our project manager, together with Holly Wallington from Defra. Holly will not be on the call because she's on maternity leave, but she's been throughout the whole process, and I think it's worth it that we mention her name at the very beginning. But Kyle will be with us on the question and answer, just in case you have any additional question. And we roughly have about 25 minutes to tackle any particular question. Then I asked our chief scientist in BGS, John Rees, who was the former director of the Coastal Group, to kind of wrap up the meeting with ideas and what have we learned and whatever John seems appropriate. But before we actually go and dive into the project, I'm going to pass the floor to Lydia Breslin from Defra, who is going to do the official opening of today's event. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then pass the word to you, Lydia. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Andres. I hope everyone can hear and see me. Thanks very much for joining this meeting. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lydia Breslin. I'm one of the team leaders here in Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Directorate. My team leads on coastal erosion innovation and flood recovery. And this project is one of that falls within my team. I just want to say thank you to everyone for all the work you've put into this project. This has been a 2-year project and actually started on the 24th of March, 2021, sorry. So we're coming up to the anniversary really of the 2 years. So just a big thank you to all the project board members. Holly, the project manager, is, as we've said, we've had, she's not been able to be here because she's on maternity leave, but she has been the driving force behind this, working with Andres and Kyle. So massive thank you to her. Thanks to colleagues from the Environment Agency. Thanks to colleagues from Natural Resources Wales as well for all your input and all the others that have been involved in this project. So I hope that the findings will be shared and we'll all learn some, moving forward onto this project. So thanks very much. Over to you, Andres.
Thank you, Lydia. So let me then go and start with the overview of the project. Just give me 1 second. And then I'll share my screen. There you go. So finger crossed, you can all see my slides again. I'm using one of the outputs of the project to actually give you the overview of the whole project, which is what we call the evidence compendium slide pack. But just to give you a flavor of the amount of information that we have produced, only the evidence compendium is 70 pages, 70 slides long. So it's a lot to cover, but we will try to condense everything for you today. So let's start with what is the research aim that we've been doing. As you can read, so we've been trying to collate historical coastal change evidence and create a methodological framework to monitor and document historical coastal change for both England and Wales coastlines. And I would like to kind of pause for a second before I go into a bit more technical details, but just to give you something more familiar that you might be with, if you try to provide evidence of change, or for example, your family, and you have to search all the different sources of information that you might have, photos, albums, records, you can see it's already a big challenge. If you look at the last 130, 40 years, doing that just for your familiar record is a challenge. If you want to do this for the whole coast of England and Wales, you can imagine how big is the challenge. One key thing that I want to kind of put in everybody's mind is that because we are doing this for policy, informing policy, historical for us means since we have maps that we can trust and that we can use, and therefore we can map change over time. And that's what you will probably see coming clearly as we go through. But the task is, it was massive, and hopefully you will see how the details has been sorted as we go through. We have to develop something and then communicate the methodology to an audience target, and in this case is mostly policymakers. So if you look at the outputs that we have produced, they are not produced for the general public. They are produced for those policy people, trying to address the main concerns they might have over those. Today's event is more for the general public, so we will try to translate what we have produced into more easy, understandable terminology. So to start with, we have 3 main tasks as part of this project. So if you want to do this exercise of find all the evidence of coastal change in England and Wales, so we did 3 things that are actually quite obvious. So I'm not going to read the slides, you can read them, but I'm going to kind of explain them in plain words. So the first thing you need to do is, well, has this already been done? Do we need to do it again, or has been already done a similar analysis, the one that Defra and Natural Resource Wales was looking for? Because if it has already been done, we don't need to do it again. That was pretty much the starting point. And that's what we call technically doing a rapid evidence assessment. And you will hear more on those as we go through. Then the second one is, if you are trying to provide evidence, what are the monitoring approaches that we have over time? So you can imagine that before the digital era, we have different methodologies and ways of measuring change. And now in the present, we have access to satellite, we have access to many other different measuring and monitoring capabilities. How do you make a compelling story using all of them? How do you combine different technologies? Again, that's a challenge, and that's what we have discussed in task 2. And finally, on task 3 is when you put all together and you will see that we actually make a pause on the project. So if the evidence coming from the one and the second were supportive to continue and going ahead and develop a methodology, then we have to actually develop the methodology. And that actually means that we have to do these three main things, which is again common sense. So the first thing is, we are not the first one trying to map historical coastal change in the world, and not if you look at particular places, they have been doing this for many years. So how they have done things, so can we learn from them how things can be done better? And that's the first task. The other one is, well, building on the previous task and the knowledge we gathered until there, can we produce what we call an adaptable methodology? An adaptable, and I need to pause here for a second because it's adaptable to many things. It's adaptable to the users, so different teams within the policy teams in Defra and natural resource wells will be using the outcomes differently. So you have to consider adaptable to their needs. That's one thing. The other thing is adaptable to the different environments that you've got along the whole coast of England and Wales. They are very different, so you have to make sure that what you are proposing can be applied nationally with local resolution. You have to be adaptable to this one too. And finally, it has to be adaptable to what I mentioned, is the technology has changed over time and likely will change in the future. How do you make something that is robust to integrate everything we've done in the past and continue being robust in the future? So that's what we mean about adaptable methodology. And then you propose a methodology and then you demonstrate that. And we demonstrate that in 2 study cases, and we develop a platform. And I was kind of having a conversation with the people attending in person that if you only look at the reports and you don't look at the URL, kind of link to the prototype platform that we have developed, you will not get the flavor of everything we've done. So it's all combined will give you a much better idea of what we've done. So again, everything that I've said, you put this as a project proposal, it was kind of a big challenge. There is a lot of information in this slide, but I want you to focus on a couple of things. So one, if you look at the bottom of the slide, you will see that we've been working for about 2 years, as I mentioned, and the different task reports has been produced on different times on time. This compendium and this final dissemination event is trying to put everything together in one place. As I mentioned, you can see that task 1, task 2 was kind of done in parallel. And we've been doing reviews, interviews, synthesis, reporting in task 1, and consultations in task 2 with service providers, the people who produce the data, but also with the users to define the requirements. And then we have a breakout point that was when we had to make the decision. Okay, do we see that have this already been done, or do we actually to do something that we were looking for that is not been done? It was agreed that hasn't been done, so we have to do what is the 3 subtasks in task 3, and that will lead us to the final platform and the final report in task 3. So that's what we've done. And of course, we haven't done this, as Lydia mentioned at the beginning, we haven't done this alone. We have a massive support from a large number of people, including the project board, but also we got 30 members on the steering group, and I'll show you in a moment who were those to acknowledge their contributions. So again, now we're going into more detail. So what we have produced over these 2 years, a number of things. So the first 3 things that we have produced are reports. So what we will call the Rapid Evidence Assessment, or REA for short, or task 1 report. The task 2 report, which is I will refer as the monitoring report, what technologies can be used and what are the strengths and weaknesses of those. And then the final report, task 3, is when we define how do you actually do the methodology. But as I mentioned, it will be, if you only read the reports, the PDF, you will miss the important bit, which is the platform that we have developed, which include a lot of new information that put everything into context in 2 study sites, one in England, one in Wales. Then we have a dissemination event, which is where we are today, 4 summaries page project, and the evidence compendium that I'm using to talk you through everything we've done. Again, I'm not going to go in any detail, but that's kind of all the things that you see in there. I will go through the outputs, and then my colleagues will go through each one of the different tasks to give you a flavor of everything we've done. You see there is a special note in the slide at the bottom, just to manage your expectation. We haven't done this for the whole England and Wales. We have collected, we have point where that information, if you want to do the analysis where that information is, what are the challenges of using that information, and we have kind of we propose a methodology, how do you can bring them together, identify the challenges, and demonstrate some component of that methodology. But you will not find a platform already made for England and Wales that you can go and check how any particular place has changed. So we are getting towards that, but that's not what we've done in this project. So I'm going to go through the outputs quickly. Just again, is to give you a flavor of the amount of information that we are passing to the policy teams. So one is this rapid evidence assessment. It's 137 pages document long with a number of annexes that you see listed there. And then you will find all the details about how we did things, the methodology, results, and the more detailed recommendations that the one we can go through today. Then, as I mentioned, Vanessa will be explaining this in more detail. So we look at what science can actually tell us, and we produce 122 pages document containing all the results that science can tell us about coastal change in England and Wales. We've done the same looking at other sources of geographical information, and you will see 17 pages that summarize everything we've done on that. And additionally, we find what we call gray literature that was informed by the project board, things that they will consider and it was relevant for the project. You will see all them listed also in the annex. Just to give you again a flavor of the size, just looking at the publications, the academic publications, they were too many, about more than 1,000. So to be able to put all of them into a single report. So you also have a spreadsheet when we try to match the different publications, how they match to the different questions that we have on the REA task, on the rapid evidence assessment task. The second report, the task 2 report, that I will refer as the monitoring report, is about 70 pages long, and you see not only the different typologies that we have along the Great Britain coastline, but you will see also projects that were considered relevant, like the coastal zone mapping project that was done by the Geospatial Commission led by UKHO, the UK Hydrographic Office. Again, there was kind of an interest on not duplicating efforts, so we went through what has been done on those projects, so we make sure we don't duplicate any effort, but we build on those. And then you will see the outputs of the consultation we have with the service providers and the data users. Again, a couple of annexes on this one. One is a spreadsheet. Why we put a spreadsheet in there is because when I go in a bit more detail in a second, you will realize, and that's me presenting on task 2, that the list of things that we were asked to go through is a bit of a mix of data products, technologies, platforms, processing approaches. So we have to kind of atomize those into a more digestible format, and that's why we have a matrix to try to go through all of them. So you combine the matrix with the report, and then we give you a flavor of what we've done on the monitoring side. And finally, the last one, the task 3, is where we actually have proposed how this adaptable methodology should look like. Why? Give the principles of how this one looks like. Again, it's a long document, 87 pages document. How we have kind of illustrate this in 2 study cases, why we have selected those study cases, etc., etc. Again, you will find 2 annexes on this one. One is when you look at how different countries actually around the world has actually mapped and visualized historical coastal change. And I'll pause here for a second because it is worth it to mention that thanks to Dynamic Scotland project, who's been really supportive from the beginning, we have learned quite a lot. And I think it's worth it to mention that in Scotland, they have been doing this before we are doing this project. And it's honest to acknowledge that we are building on what they have done, and they're being engaged throughout the project. So for that, I'm really thankful, and many others. And finally, and probably the one that will be the most engaging things for you to look at rather than report is the URL that is going to be open, so you can all access and play around with what we've done, and it'll give you a much better idea of everything we've done. So today we are on the final event, so I'm not going to say much more on this one. The video will be, as I mentioned, hosted in BGS YouTube channel and available through Defra. And with this one, I would like to go to the reference. So as I mentioned, those are the main 3 reports that we have produced, and you will get access to the document later on. As I want to finish acknowledging everybody who's contributed to this project, who's been a massive team effort, I have to say. You see the contractor team, I already mentioned all of us. You see the project board team members, You've got a list of all the different policy teams and all around England and Wales, and the massive 30 members steering group that we have throughout, from people from not only England and Wales, but also US, ES in America, Japan, and Spain. So with this one, I'm going to stop talking and then pass the floor to, that will be James. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So James, I believe you can share your screen to go through the lessons learned on the rapid evidence assessment.
Here we go. And I hope I can share my screen. Has that come up?
Yeah, we can see the slides. We're good to go.
Okay. Thank you, Andres, for the introduction and for managing the project. I'd like to join Andres in thanking the project board and the steering group who've been very supportive.
1 second, I'm going to try to speak to make your speaker louder. Just 1 second. Come again?
I'd like to thank Andres, the other members of the team, the project board and the steering group who, as Andres has said, have been very supportive throughout, very engaged with this process. I'm also going to show you some of the slides from the slide deck that you will get. There are too many of them for me to go into in detail. Well, I do want to show some of them to show what the rapid evidence assessment was about. So we were looking at evidence of historical coastal change, provide as sort of synthesis and conclusions, and outline evidence gaps. So we're looking at both built environment, communities, and an actual physical environment. And we're looking at a range of different evidence from different timescales. If you look at the bar along the bottom, from 1870s, we were getting...
James, sorry for interrupting you 1 sec, but can you get close to your microphone? Because we could hear Lydia well, but we can hear you really low.
I don't know if this is any better.
Well, the louder you can speak, the better, yes.
Okay, so in the 1870s, we're looking at map data for the sort of first county series of the OS maps. 1953 was, of course, the date of the big storm surge, which led to the beginning of a program of building coastal defenses. In the year 2000, 2010, we were with SMP 1 and 2. 2015, we've got a picture of a satellite data, because around that time we were getting Landsat 8 and 9, and then the start of the Sentinel programs. So it's bringing a whole different type of data to the table. So skip over that. We're looking at relevant grey literature, which is particularly where I came in. We look at published scientific journal articles, which is what Vanessa will be talking about later. And we did some interviews as well. And we've provided, split it up roughly into the two periods, 1890 to 1990, where we're looking at maps, charts, limited measurements of cliff position, beach profiles, some limited data on waves and water levels, although a lot of tide gauges, obviously. Little information was collected in habitats, although some individual habitat inventories existed. From 1990 to present day, with the advent of more and more powerful, more and more mobile computers, we've gathered increasing volumes of data. However, often data sources are scattered and data has not necessarily been synthesized at either regional or national scale. So looking at historical coastal change, and we know there's great advances taken forward by setting up a national network of regional coastal monitoring programs, the Wales Coastal Monitoring Centre, because data is so powerful, and data is even more powerful when it is follows the fair data principles, data that you can find, that is accessible, It is interoperable, so numbers of people can use it, and it is reusable. And those are the principles of the National Network of Regional Coastal Monitoring Programs in the World's Coastal Monitoring Centre. You collect the data once, you store it, you collate it, you present it to the public, and you make it available for a variety of uses, some of which you hadn't even dreamed of when you started collecting this data. But there are still gaps in the evidence. So we were asked some questions about the natural environment. Those are the questions, and we'll go through some of the answers in time. So we were looking at the length of the coastline. Of course, the length of the coastline depends upon the scale at which you map it. So we've got some different sources of coastlines at different scales and providing different coastline lengths. So the erosion had coastline of England of 4,273 kilometers, whereas the US master map at much finer scale has it as 15,662 kilometers. Similarly for Wales, different sorts of mappings, different scales give you different results. What is the length of the changing coastline? Well, we've looked at the National Coastal Erosion Risk Monitoring and done a quick analysis of the GIS from that to get a table of results for what percentage, and we also have maps showing where these different rates of erosion are occurring. So physical characteristics of the coastline, that can be measured in a number of different ways. We've got some information from Ordnance Survey maps, charts, geological maps, habitat maps, oil spill response maps, and also the BGS GeoCoast dataset, which has recently been released. It gives coastal length and coastal lengths with high susceptibility to coastal erosion for each SMP area. That's split into 50-meter units. So there is a lot of information out there, and more is being collected and presented, like the BGS GeoCoast, so it can be used by other people. What are historical land loss and gain? We start off by the Royal Commission of Coastal Erosion and Afforestation, 1911, which is quite an entertaining read to describing the coastal losses that have occurred to that date. Then we go on to things like National Coastal Erosion Risk Mapping and the different SMPs. There was some early systematic work in Holderness, Lincolnshire and East Anglia that was developed into the national network and the Welsh Coastal Centre. One of the key points to note is that this data has often been collected and analysed, for example, in the first round of SMPs, but it wasn't centrally brought together and stored. So a lot of the data on historical coastal erosion, based on analysis of historical coastal maps of SMP1, are simply not available anymore. We need to bring this data together to collate it and make it accessible. What have been habitats that serve coastal protection function? We're obviously talking about salt marshes, sand dunes, vegetated shingle, and mud flats, maritime cliff and slope, and beaches. So these have been mapped by various organisations at different times, and we're very grateful to them to do that. And I'm very grateful that there are places like the MAGIC website, multi-agency geographical information for the countryside, which is collating quite a lot of number of these data sets and making them available through a single portal. Again, it's making the data available and keeping old versions, not just replacing the old version with the newest version. To assess change, we need to keep the old versions and the new versions ideally collected in a consistent manner, although some updates are inevitable, so we can assess the change. So there'll be a number of schemes that protect the coastline. We don't have a national database of coastal event schemes. The Defra and Environment Agency publish lists of funded schemes for each funding round, but we don't have an overall central list of schemes. What? Total losses of built environment. We don't know is the shortest answer to this question. And one of the reasons we don't know all the properties have been lost because local authorities are looking forwards. So they may collect evidence of losses to inform where coastal change is happening so they can plan for future coastal change, but they are looking forward. The previous report, we're looking at some estimates of historical losses, and there have been a number of projections of potential future losses by committing climate change, S&Ps, etc. So these are properties expected to be lost. These are projected losses, not historical losses. So we'll look at coastal protection structures, and again, there are a number of partial data sets. We've got information from OS maps, coastal protection surveys, shoreline management plans, scoring manuals, the Environment Agency databases, National Resource Wales, National Asset Database, CCO have a database of coastal defences. So there's quite a few data sources out there. But the fact that, you know, for example, in the picture on the left of the groins, there is a groin there, but it's not doing much use. The fact it's marked on the map, it might be on a database, doesn't mean it's actually of much effectiveness. So we're looking at expenditure on sea defences, and again, it's available. Some sources of information is available for the past 2 years and how much money has been committed. And we also know some estimates of the cost of specific events, such as the winter 2013-14 flooding. There's the SodeWatch database, Survive and Hague and Co., which has done a very good job of collecting information about historical SODE events and presenting them and making them publicly available. So we're looking at a large number of nuisance flooding events and a relatively low number of disaster. So they categorize it into these different categories and provide more information about the more severe ones from the less severe. Then we're merging on to the coastal communities, which is more where Corsairs comes in. So I think I'll stop there, if I may.
Thank you, James. That was brilliant. Another going through everything was a big challenge. So I'm gonna probably ask you to. Well, I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, well, Paul, you are sharing your screen, right? I don't need to share for you.
I'm going to share my screen.
Thank you. So then we're moving with Paul Sawyer. We're moving to lessons learned within the rapid evidence assessment, but focusing on the coastal community. So Paul, all yours. Speak as loud as you can, please.
That's quite loud. Andreas, is that okay?
That's okay.
So yeah. Thanks, James, for giving the introduction, all the other sections to that. So as James says, I'll pick up on the communities side. I won't go through the questions on this slide because they come up as we talk about each one, but suffice to say that there are a series of secondary questions, as it was called in the rapid evidence review, around what do we understand around coastal communities. And the first one asks how many communities are there within the coastal change zone. So notionally, that's quite an easy question, but there are two quite difficult concepts in that statement. What is a community and what is coastal change? And we didn't really find any publications that answer that specific question. They could be answered, taking in that definition by the Welsh National Marine Plan that has that contiguous coastal urban area greater than half a square kilometre as a community. That could be answered with some additional analysis, but fundamentally we didn't really see any national agreement on what a community was within the evidence. And there was one comment by the Chief Medical Officer, his coastal report, that highlighted that there was no internationally agreed definition or consensus on what constitutes a coastal community, and everyone uses that in quite a different way. So in our review of the literature, we explore the various definitions, and there's quite a few of coastal community, and we highlight that the one just based on contiguous urban area is probably not most useful from a monitoring perspective. And we talk about different versions of that in the literature review of who's used what and where. The next question around the coastal communities highlighted how many residential, do we know how many residential and non-residential properties there are at risk today in the undefended floodplain, and has that changed? Well, we don't know exactly, but there are some studies. So the climate change risk assessment set out the number of properties, people rather, in the coastal floodplain, in the undefended floodplain, of around 1.2 million. That analysis is included within the National Flood Risk Assessment, but not easily accessed as just a coastal figure. There is also a connection to the what a community is. So the undefended flood zone in this question is assumed to provide geographic limit to the coastal hinterland, and not really think about whether communities extend across that. So this could quite easily split a community. So that highlighted again how that definition between the secondary question 1 around what a community is and then what the floodplain is a difficult thing to square. So some properties that form part of a contiguous urban footprint that lie outside of the boundary of the coastal subplain are not considered at risk, for example. The third question also focused on just some basic understanding, if you like, which you think would be quite an easy question to answer, of what critical infrastructure was in the area of coastal change. Now, the Environment Agency published, obviously, the National Flood Risk Assessment and the long-term investment scenarios, both build on the national receptor data sets. But again, they don't readily report exposure within the coastal floodplain. But there have been some studies, again, the CCRA, Climate Change Risk Assessment, did highlight some numbers around water distribution and treatment, about 350 of those, power stations and substations, as well as grouping up emergency services such as GP surgeries, hospitals and schools, etc. But we also noted that our understanding of what critical infrastructure is, even within the base data, like the national receptor data set, remains variable and continues to improve. There's not a static, clear understanding of where those pieces of critical infrastructure are and how to count them. The fourth question was quite interesting, particularly interesting in how many people with a high social vulnerability live in the coastal floodplain. So the ONS, the Office of National Statistics report, highlights around about 5.3 million people live in coastal towns. So slightly different phrasing around what a community is, but in coastal towns, of which 3.5 million of those are in seaside towns, which they define as having some kind of visitor attraction. So again, a slightly different version of what a community is. And it highlighted within the social vulnerability context that many of those coastal seaside towns have higher shares of unemployment, higher shares of part-time employment than other places, as well as a lower share of degree qualifications. They also highlighted in some coastal communities, there's around a lot are in decline in terms of population. And these ONS studies echoed some work by the JRF, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the Climate Change Risk Assessment that looked at neighbourhood flood vulnerability through an NFVI index and highlighted that those in coastal geographies, in the coastal floodplain, were systematically disadvantaged. They were at higher risk. The most vulnerable people in coastal communities were at higher risk than others. So there was a discrepancy at the coast. Fifth question moved from the social vulnerability to start thinking about economic risk. What do we know currently, what's published currently around economic risk within the coastal floodplain. And again, the national flood risk assessments and the long-term investment scenarios talk about that, but it's difficult to mine it just for the coastal side. So that's difficult to extract from those studies just for the present day coastal pictures, but it is reported again in the climate change risk assessment that expresses the expected annual damage present day and how it might change in the future, estimating coastal to be around about 60 million in residential and non-residential of 80 million expected annual damages. Interestingly, coastal flooding was reported as being lower today than the other sources of risk, but much more sensitive to climate change. So it increased faster than the other risks. We also note that the NAFRA 2, National Flood Risk Assessment 2, is now in progress. Wasn't at the start, but is now in progress, and probably will change the estimates of the present day risk as we see. And also Natural Resources Wales have also updated their national assessments. And finally, the question was touched on of the, it's not finally, but the degree of preparedness. How prepared are people in the coastal floodplain to flooding? And we found in the literature that it's quite difficult to define in a universal way. For example, the long-term investment scenarios and the climate change risk assessments, many other studies trying to think about it as risk, and that is viewed as a proxy. The residual risk is viewed as a proxy for preparedness. But other perspectives in the literature include how communities might be able to recover from a flood, and they think of that through proxies of insurance and warning and property level take up. And there is some information in the literature on that. So insurance, a study for Flood Re highlighted that around about 32% of households exposed to significant flooding may be without insurance, and the majority of those are at the coast. And warning, studied by the agency, suggested about 1.4 million people have signed up to warning. Natural Resources Well have a similar thing. And then property level measures, some studies highlighted that those properties that have experienced flooding before take it up, but only by about 20% or so, and those who haven't the lower percentage. One of the key drivers of change, of course, is how many new developments of properties have been built in the coastal floodplain during a particular period. And there's been a few studies on that. The National Trust highlighted around urban development, added urban development assets for the coast. And then the Adaptation Subcommittee suggested around about 15,000 new buildings were built in the coastal areas with a 1% chance of flooding. And analysis for the JRF suggested that the proportion of new development on the floodplain takes place in the most socially vulnerable communities. And then work by the LSE also gave us some insights suggesting that around about 5% of 1.3 million homes built between 2008 and 18 are located in the high-risk areas. But there's not a coherent set of analysis going back time. Okay, with that, Andreas, I shall hand back to you.
Thank you, Paul. So now we are moving from, you can stop sharing your screen. I'm gonna prepare the slides for Vanessa, who is presenting in person. So give me 1 sec. And now again, that's the last presentation on the RIA, on the Rapid Evidence Assessment, and now from the perspective of what science can tell us. So that would do. So Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Andres, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to present. I guess mine's more of a presentation about process, because it's the data that has been collated by our experts, and my expertise does not lie in coastal research. But so I'm going to say a bit about my role in the project, why I was contributing, the challenges that we encountered, the lessons learned, some of the research ways forward. Perhaps you may or may not agree with my perspective on those, and some thanks, because I think this has been a really great project and really enjoyed the opportunity to engage with it. Thank you. So I was involved with the initial proposal, and it was good to be involved with that because it helped with the collaborations. As somebody new to the research community, it was good to have that opportunity to engage, so that when we hit the ground knowing who we all were and what we were doing. So the key role was engaging with the peer review literature in a quick scoping methodology approach, which contributes to the research evidence, and really underpinned the major components that were pulled together by our research experts. In doing this, because we want it to be reproducible, I maintained a log of activities and went through a first pass review of all the abstracts that we collected and filtered those so that the experts could pick them up. So there's an appendix which includes those summaries, and you'll see how they've been refined and taken forward in the context of the grey literature. As Andres mentioned, the data are also presented in a series of sheets, each one allocated to a research question. And it's been a pleasure to contribute to workshops going forward and maintain contact with the project. So the research evidence review, basically the quick scoping approach, which was designed by Collins et al. From Defra, and they published their methodology in 2015, relies on, as Andres has already presented, the PICO element definitions, and then defining search terms around those elements. And as has been mentioned previously, we decided to focus our research interest on Scopus and Web of Science, as they hold many of the data sets that we felt we needed to tap into. It's a repeatable process in the sense that a log has been maintained and anybody could go back and use the keywords that we've identified and searched on. But it's important to note that it's date limited. You could go back in time and reproduce the exercise, but year on year, hundreds of new papers are coming forward and would need filtering as part of this exercise. While I'm on this slide, the key searches that are shown on the right-hand side of the slide, some of those identified returns of up to 7 million papers. So filtering became really important in the process. So why was I included in the project? And I've just said I'm not an expert, but we're growing a coastal team in BGS, and it was felt that I might have some skills to contribute to that, partly predicated from past experience as an engineering geologist, working on the coast in the 1990s, particularly in ground investigation. So contributing to things like groin construction, long sea outfalls as shown on this slide, and the engineered defences that we were trying to implement at the time, which obviously we're moving on from that process now. But also we were very aware that this was in the context of the land-ocean interaction study and that holistic approach that people want to try and gain for understanding sediment movement around the coast. I also have a role in our coastal landslide research and observatories, and that is underpinning some of the contributions I could make here. I'd also had previous experience with quick scoping reviews, both positively and also addressing some of the challenges, particularly the challenge that relates to the volume of data that comes back and how you refine those searches. And the searches are undertaken using Boolean operators, and keywords, and where you place your keyword searches and the terms that are defining them can make a lot of difference to the returns that come back. So the challenges were, as I say, in terms of volumes of data coming back. And in the end, we revisited this and defined search terms that were leveled at each of the key questions. And you've seen the outputs and returns on that. But taking, for example, the question about the total length of the coastline of England and Wales, that particular search returned only 131 papers. And we can see that a number of those were open access and high profile papers. And they were refined through searching the abstracts down to 16 from Web of Science, complemented with further papers from Scopus, and after duplicates were removed, etc., we were left with 18 references that might feed in. And then that data, when it came to reporting, was put into tables regarding how methods of measurements were undertaken and the lengths that were generated, which then James was using in combination with the grey literature, which I think we have to be clear, the grey literature really underpins and has guided what we've been able to achieve in the way of outputs. So the other things that we learned about this were the issues of remote working. We were in the early stages of COVID and we were trying to share data across platforms. There were initial challenges, but we soon overcame those. And I think the sharing of information went particularly well once we got into the swing of things. The other thing I'd say was responding to dependencies. We had critical deadlines to deliver to, and the volume of returns meant that this was taking more time than perhaps we'd originally allowed, but we worked hard to try and constrain that because it needed to match with the deliveries from the grey literature so that James and Paul could pull together the information that you've seen this afternoon. So personally, I was quite surprised not to address the answers to, in fact, any of the questions directly from the literature. And as I've just mentioned, the grey literature adds a very significant value to these returns. And the grey literature is the area that really requires the experts to dig them out, find them, interpret them. And part of that is knowing what's out there. And, you know, one couldn't do this without that background expertise that comes with James and Paul and Andres and the steering group that guided us through this. It's interesting to note that the research is, as has already been mentioned, I think, in pockets. There are areas of specialization and there are a number of key areas geographically that people go back to and revisit time and time again. And whilst that is perhaps surprising in some ways, and it focuses research to a smaller area than you might ideally like from a national scale survey, it has the advantage of providing high resolution baseline data. And I think that some of that is really worth going back to and revisiting and celebrating. And then another key thing that I think came out of this was the valuable insight for defining ecosystem services, and that's feeding into the community's socioeconomic work and the geomorphological aspects of our research. That is a current sort of research theme and fits and aligns very well to what we're trying to achieve with these research questions. So on a personal basis, I really enjoyed being part of the project, and I'm further convinced by the research evidence approach. It's really good to have that structure, but at the same time, we have to appreciate it's not just a procedure that you can follow without thought. It needs flexibility of approach and a sort of changing and developing input as you go along. For personal purposes, I've enjoyed engaging with the coastal research and really have benefited from the collaborative working. The skills that we've gained from cross-centre working, I think, are obvious. Perhaps less obvious is the separation of time. So having somebody collecting the peer-reviewed literature enabled the experts to seek out the grey literature and then merge it as we got closer to delivering the outputs. And it's been good to be an ongoing part of the project and see the impact of this work. And perhaps that it lies within the modern computing technology and platforms that we're going to see more of later on. This type of platform and process was inconceivable in the 1990s. I remember going to a county council to see GIS in operation. So how far we've come in this timescale, and it's really impressive what we can contribute for better understanding the impacts of climate change and trying to address this changing coastal environment. And looking to the future, there's this great opportunity for linking onshore and offshore processes. Again, perhaps something that we were trying to achieve in the 1990s, but now are much better placed with the technology to revisit this. And I think we've also learned a lot about the value of baselines and understanding what our baselines are, where we measure them to, how we document them, and consistency of approach. So many things that have come out. And I'd like to say thank you, and that's thank you to the management team. Andres, it's been great working with you locally, but I know that's been enabled by the contributions from Defra and Natural Resources Wales. It's been a great collaboration in that sense. The cross-centre working seems to work very effectively from my perspective, and I hope that's the perspective of everyone here. And the advisory group has been invaluable, and it's been remarkable how openly engaged they've been. They've given advice and worked constructively to enable us to complete this project. So thank you.
Thank you. With this one, we kind of finished the overview of the RIA evidence assessment, and this is only task one. But I hope that you have a much better flavor of the work that we did, the people behind the work, and all the challenges that we have to came across. So we are now moving slowly towards the monitoring approaches. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible again. I'm going to share my screen. Again, hopefully you can see that again. As I say, I'm moving now. We have come done with task one. I'm moving now to the task two. This is going to be super quick because the interesting bit is coming on the task three. But so let me pause on this one for a sec. As I mentioned, there is a lot being done. But there is always the risk that you might be duplicating effort. So one of the very first things that we have to do is contextualize what we were doing in the context of the complexity of the coast. So where England and Wales are very different. You walk along the coast, you will find very different places. How do we contextualize everything in that sense, on the diversity that we have in our coast? But the other one is how do we contextualize this on all the other efforts that are going on at the same time as we are doing this one. And one that was flagged by the policy team early in the project was the coastal zone mapping 1 and 2 projects. So we have a particular task to frame everything we're doing within that. Then there was a requirement to go through a particular list of techniques, and that's the list you see on your screen. And again, the policy team who put together the tender have another massive challenge because yeah, it's a huge task. So they have to kind of compress as much as they could what they were looking for. And that's kind of condensed on that list. As you see, it's a minimum requirement. It doesn't mean that it's the only thing we have to look at, but that's a minimum that we have to look at. Then you see that I mentioned a few things about what do we got from the stakeholder consultations, in particular, the strengths and opportunities and weakness that we found on the different technique and approaches. To kind of fill some of the gaps, I'll kind of quickly mention 3 use cases to give you a flavor of everything we've done and where we were when we started the last task, the task number 3. So I'm gonna try to be brief on this one and make it as light as possible. But to start with, as I mentioned, if you walk along the coast on England and Wales, you will find many different places. So if you have to kind of cluster or classify the different typologies, you can do this in many different ways. And the one that I'm showing you on the screen is just one way. That is, if you look at the topography, and in particular, if you are worried about how the coast might respond to sea level rise, that's the first thing you want to know, is how is the topography, what is the shape of the topography, because different shape will respond differently to sea level rise. And this is one of the potential ways you can cluster things. So we identify 10 clusters and then we map it, all of them along actually all England and Wales. And to give you a flavor of what do we have, you might think that a cliff, it's important in the whole GB, but actually 71% of the GB coast is classified as gentle coast, so it will suffer from sea level rise if not protected. And the remaining 29% is a cliff coast, different typologies, but that will be a cliff. So the cliff coast is a small proportion for the whole GB, and that's something important to consider. So then, as I mentioned, the Geospatial Commission, these 2 projects, Coastal Zone Mapping 1 and 2, with 2 different but related aims. The first project was to get together and identify which data and surveys were kind of being done across agencies. And the second project was more focused on making sure that that data is accessible and findable. So just to say that they didn't look at how do you use those, particularly topographical and bathymetrical data. You have an example of bathymetry and topography on the image next to the text. They didn't address the question, how do you use this one to actually quantify change? This was most, how do you get a bathymetry? How do you get a topography? Or how do you use this one to quantify change? Was not addressed on those 2 projects. So that's why we continue going ahead with task 3. Again, as I mentioned, the list is that the minimum list of techniques we have to go through is the one that you see in there, and you can see we have things like goes from historical maps, from aerial photography, satellite imagery, topography survey. So it's a bit of a mix of technology, platform, processing, map, or products. So we try to make sense of all of them. We try to put in place how you can combine all different techniques and technologies and platforms to produce the data that you need to quantify change. But again, one thing is mapping, where you have a different time and different epochs on time. And the other thing is using that to quantify change. And this project is all about quantifying change. So measuring is just the first step. How do you do the change analysis? The second one. So we kind of engage in consultation with both service providers and end users of all sort of technologies. And there you have the numbers of the kind of people that was represented on the workshop. So from the national government, academic, industry, and as a commercial industry. They're representing most of the UK for every region of the UK in particular. So we try to make as broad as possible. Again, difficult to condense everything in today's call. And I just put one image there because I think it's worth it to flag it, that satellite, when you're looking at more contemporaneous monitoring techniques, the use of satellite is something that is becoming more and more used worldwide. And the UK has been working with companies like Argans and funded by ESA, the European Space Agency, through the last 2.5–3 years on developing this and applying this to GB. But still a lot to do, but we are getting there, and that was flagged and discussed in length during the workshops. When you ask the participants, and again, this is a summary, there is way more in the report. When you ask what do they value to actually monitor coastal change, you see that the first thing they value makes sense. The longer the register you have, the better. And that came with a lot of challenges because what you were able to monitor 100 years ago, you can do the same thing, but very different accuracy and resolution today. But you see the resolution is the second one, coverage, easy of use, and cost. So all those details, you will find them in the task 2 report. That's the last one I'm going to be presenting on this monitoring approach. And I'll flag again and again that one thing is taking in snapshots of what do you have at different epochs in time. And I'm not talking only about the natural environment, I'm talking about the built environment and communities. One thing is getting those snapshots. A very different thing is quantifying change. That's a much more different thing to do. But it's been done. It's not been done at the national level, what Defra Natural Resource Wells wanted. But there are examples, and we bring 3 examples. You see the 3 use cases as I named there. The first one, the shoreline change analysis, is focus on the natural environment. If you want to see how the natural environment changed, there is a method that is well known and has been applied in different places, and we provide example, and we learn a lot by doing that. If you are looking at how the land use, the built environment has changed, again, there are references. We describe the whole, all the actors that you need, all the decisions you have to make to do that by a particular use case. And if you want to do a change in the community, and in particular, in this case, we look at the change in the community awareness, again, at different approaches, different assumptions and things you have to do to do that. But it's possible and it's doable, but has not been done at the national level. So with all that information, that's how we get into the task 3. And it's when I'm going to go past to now Chris to give an overview. That was super quick. Yes, I know, I got you there. But I'm going to go and pass to the task 3 slides. That is you, and I'll share my screen. There we go. Let's get that again. And Chris, ready when you're ready. All yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andres. So I'm going to take you back over a slide that Andres showed you as a second slide. And this is really the crux of we're coming towards an adaptable methodology to monitor and document historical coastal change in England and Wales. So we had those 3 tasks, if you recall, looking back at the way that we can visualize and communicate coastal change data by looking at historic examples from other locations for national and international approaches that are currently being used. We developed prioritized this adaptable methodology. And Andres talked about what we mean by adaptable. That's adaptable to different circumstances. So different availabilities of data in England and Wales, for example. Different coastal landforms may require different methodologies, and different users will require different resolutions, geographic and temporal timescales, as well as different outputs. So it's adaptable. It's got to be flexible to the environment and the uses we need. And then the third element of this part of the project was a pilot demonstration of those techniques in 2 small areas, which were both rural and urban environments. The scope of this covers the whole coast, so it doesn't matter whether it's eroding or accreting, loss or gain. It covered natural processes and artificial processes, so that might be setback, mandatory alignment, or indeed reclamation. We're covering the whole coastline, so change at the whole coastline, whatever that is. And as Andres indicated, we're covering these different themes, as well as coastal change itself. We're looking at coastal change within physical environments, the sedimentary environment, the natural environment, habitats, and the built environment, so the including defences themselves. So the overall outputs at this stage of the project has been what's coming next, hopefully, this bespoke platform that allows for the visualization of the outputs. That integrates data from data and information, including the static change maps, the coastal change maps, but also a range of contextual data that help us put that change into the context of, say, the land use, the habitats, the protected areas, for example, which also form a basis for filtering the data within sort of geographic areas. It's a monitoring and historic coastal change project. So there's a need for the ability to update. So we've incorporated that within the platform. We've used a suite of use cases to help us identify what the interfaces should look like and what the change maps and reports should contain. And those use cases were drawn from the consultations with the stakeholders, our own experience of working in different sectors within the large team. So that included shoreline management planners, coastal communities, lost my track, conservation management, local land use planners, and of course the national policy advisors as well. So that's the context by which we come to this, to develop this data sets and display them. I'm stuck. Okay. So there's no one single way of monitoring coastal change, and as this profile shows, there are a lot of features that we could capture and to identify change over time. Collecting the same feature multiple times allows us to capture change. So what we've done is recommend a multi-line approach to historical database with the shoreline change, and propose a series of lines, some of which are available from mapping, others which are available from Earth, can be calculated from Earth observation, and then features such as cliff top and dune top. And then we're also needing to capture all those other components of the change landscape, which is physical characteristics, the form of the coastline, the habitat data sets as well, and the built environment, defenses, etc. So those prioritized methods that we sort of came down to 5 methods. The multiple data sets generated out of them. But the first one is this historic and modern cartographic digital data. So those can date from, say, 1840. So we've got 180 years potentially of record from the earliest high quality 1 to 6 inch and 1 to 25 inch Ordnance Survey data, right up to the modern digital OS maps. So it forms a very strong data set. It's still got errors and uncertainties associated with it. And part of the task is to understand what those are and to make sure that those are going to be available as well. So those are tidal levels. We then use satellite-derived Earth observation data to capture other water lines that were on the last slide and datum tide lines. Those date from around 1984 when the first Landsat imagery was available, and consequently, in the future. And now we're using open source data from Sentinel-2 to continue to capture that. So it's ongoing available. We're using airborne LiDAR, light detection and ranging. Thank you. It was in my head. And sort of aerial photogrammetric techniques to identify 3D profiles, which we can draw across the coastline, but also to extract volumes and to look at and to, well, I mean, we're illustrating that by using cliff top and toe extraction. And those data sets are available from around 1998 onwards. But that's not, we don't need to stop there. There are other data sets we can derive which are more instructive, essentially. Perhaps they're moving from the data to the information. So creating data sets of indices and coastal behavior and cluster analysis is one example of those, and there are many others. And then finally, as Vanessa was saying, there's a lot of data already undertaken at very high resolution for very localized studies. And that's a very valuable data set because it's both capturing the data, but also interpreting the response. So it's one thing having data, it's another thing understanding why the coastline is changing. So those were seen as an important component to collate and add into the platform. So we demonstrated this for 2 study sites in England and Wales, the northern shore of the Severn Estuary from Penarth to the Usk Estuary at Newport, and then from the Hampshire and Sussex coast from Langston Harbour to the Arun Estuary in Littlehampton. And we're coming on to sort of see what the platform, but the data sets we collected are stored on the platform. That includes the raw data from the shorelines themselves. So that's the data extraction from the maps and the imagery, etc., LiDAR data, capturing and calculating the rates of change. So that might be against a baseline and capturing from profile data. Areas of change, so there's a volume of loss as well, there's area of loss, a volume of loss, and so we're trying to capture all of those components from this data. A critical component in relation to the users is what level of aggregation do we want? Do we want the data to be at a local, a regional, or a national level? And those require different types of processing and different summaries, so that's a key component of this. And then we've integrated dynamic reporting into the program so that the user can define and filter the data to their own particular needs, but using templates so that they can use a structured report if that's what they wish to do. So all of that's been focused on a couple of demonstrator areas, and what we're really looking at is how we can scale up to a national coverage. So we've done 2 small areas. What are the principles, at least, of scaling up? So we want to achieve consistent data from around the English and Welsh coasts, recognizing that some of those data sets are not going to be the same. So the habitat maps are rather different from England and Wales. It's the consistency, not necessarily exactly the same data, but the consistency of the messages we're getting from the data. The ability to discriminate features from multiple data sources. So as technologies change, we want to be able to pick up the same feature. So we start with maps, we're now using high resolution LiDAR data, but can we pick out those same features of relevance and to chart change over time? There's some big gaps in the data. I think we heard from James about the challenge of answering some of those questions, and so there are some of the biggest challenges I think are in the physical, natural, and built environment, the human environment. And although we didn't cover it in this part of the project, the social environment, the social indicators are particularly important to add as we scale up to national. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to document the errors and uncertainties in our estimates. Often relative change is more accurate than absolute change, so we need to understand that. It's important when users want to use the data that they can have confidence in what they're getting. So metadata is important, data about the data. We want users to be able to access all the data from the raw data right through to the processed data, the summary and the visualizations, and potentially using this sort of hotspot notion where there are areas of particular concern, then there's likely to be other studies that can feed into that. And so perhaps tiered structures of detail. A key element of this project has been trying to ensure that the data is open and accessible under an open government license. That's not always possible, but what we want to try and manage is to ensure there are as few restrictive licenses as possible. And then the last element is to be able to extend the platform. At the moment, it's a demonstrator, but if it's going to subsist, it needs to be supported and maintained as an ongoing resource within coastal monitoring and historic change. There are other things going on out there. There are other programs of work undertaking coastal monitoring, and it's important to see this in that light. So the National Network of Regional Coastal Monitoring Programs is a particularly important resource with which to exchange or integrate this activity. Thank you very much.
Great. And with this one, now we are getting into the actual platform. That's where you actually see the platform in action. So I'm going to open the link using one of the slides that I have. Is that mine? Yes. Yes. Open this link. Open that. And so Andy, floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity to come and talk about the platform that we developed. I'm Andy Murdoch from Maploom. Myself and Yanis Sophos, my colleague, developed this prototype. I must stress it is a demonstrator, a prototype, so it's not fully polished, but hopefully it gives you a really good idea of the sorts of things that we could do with a coastal change platform. And making use of a wide range of data sets that have either been collected already and pre-analysed, pre-cooked, if you will, or those that we actually analyse on the fly. So here's the system. It's a standard mapping interface with various sort of controls and layers of information which are organised down the left-hand side. So we have quite a large number of data sets and bits of information. And as we said, we focused on these two areas. So if I zoom into one of them, one of the things we discussed was, the capturing of a historic Ordnance Survey data. So we've got the modern digital mapping right the way back to the earliest county series data and things, different data sets in between. So we can see the actual change. We can visualize that change against different backgrounds. So we've got aerial photography, we can make it blank if we wish, and then there's also various tools that we can play around with to kind of calculate distances and so on. So
sorry, I can't see the slides.
Sorry?
I can't see the slides online.
Ah.
I'm not the only one.
I was wondering.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Otherwise you miss all the fun. Yeah. Give me 1 sec.
Andy, would you go back to the beginning of your presentation as we couldn't see the slides?
Yeah, no, sorry, I was assuming that I was continuing sharing the screen. Can you see a map of the UK now?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, brilliant. So Andy, I'm afraid you have to go again from the
That's
beginning.
all right.
There you go.
Sorry, a bit like here's the repeat. So let me go back to the start. Yeah, so essentially we've got this mapping interface. Lots of data layers available down the left-hand side. As we've talked about, we've got these areas of interest where we've gathered information. So if I just zoom in on one of them, which is this Pagham Harbour area near Chichester, we have different layers of information that was captured from the Ordnance Survey mapping. So we're able to take coastline features out of that data set. And going back through time, Chris and his team at GeoData have been capturing digitally some of the shorelines from those maps by tracing them off of the maps, and we can start to build up a picture of the change that's occurred. And as I mentioned, there's this ability to show against different backgrounds, so against aerial photography, against a blank background, and then also to have the ability to measure using different tools. So there's a large amount of the platform is really just about putting data on there, and that's fine to a point, but it's also good to be able to provide some pre-cooked data, if you will, some pre-analyzed data that allows us to visualize a lot better what's going on. So in the system, we also have a selection of data sets that are available to be able to visualize that change in a simple way. So this is colleagues at HRWallingford have done some analysis on a section of the coast, and you can see the areas in blue of accretion and areas of erosion in red. And clearly that's a very useful and very quick way to visualize what's actually going on without actually having to do any actual analysis yourself. And as Chris mentioned earlier, there's this request to be able to aggregate that up to different scales for different purposes. So you might choose to aggregate at the 1 kilometre level or more generally, or you could aggregate against shoreline management plan units and so on. So being able to add a bit of extra interpretation onto the mapping really helps. And one of the things that we've done in the demonstrator is also to do some little bit of analysis on the LiDAR data, and you saw this slide earlier, but essentially what we're looking at here, rather than just the LiDAR data, what we've actually done is done a change analysis on the LiDAR and presented it so that you can see the areas again in blue that have accreted and eroded in red. And so over time, you can see how those rates have changed and how those landforms have changed. And by showing it against a hill shaded background, you can really start to get a feel for what's going on with the topography. And you know, we're very lucky in the UK and in England in particular with the Environment Agency's LiDAR programme. Some of this data is extremely highly detailed. So this is the Ribble Estuary where we did some work for Natural England a few years ago. And you can see, you know, even down to the smallest bit of salt marsh, how it's eroding and carving off the edge of the salt marsh and accreting in the channels. And then more significant changes like this managed realignment scheme, where again, you know, you can see what's been happening here. They've broken through the seawall, and these natural channels are being re-established on the LiDAR. You could see that in its early stages before that naturalness had actually started to take shape. So this must have been pretty soon after they breached the wall. So it's quite a comprehensive platform in that sense. We've got other pre-cooked data sets, work from Andres and his colleagues on this cliff metrics, which is a BGS product, and you can see, you know, how the data sets are available for you to look at. So you've got cliff positions that have been extracted from terrain modelling, and then similarly, we also now, as Chris said, start to rely increasingly on Earth observation data. So every few days now, a Sentinel image is captured for our country. And so we can use that to look at, you know, even high resolution change post-storm events and things that may have significantly altered the coastline. So you get an image, these are quite big images, but we can bring them in individually or optimize them for display on a cloud system like this. And then Andres and his team have worked a methodology that takes transects along the coast and then starts to plot positions of shorelines over time. Now, this is still experimental methodology, but very much the way that it's heading in terms of, you know, this sort of more automated analysis using high frequency resolution data sets, and it offers a lot of potential, I think. As we said, we've also got a huge amount of contextual information. So again, this is taking advantage of data sets that already exist. So things like Channel Coastal Observatory, which is a wealth of data. We can pull in feeds directly from there through the system to show things like the background context. So in this case, we've got flood defences. We could also look at the shoreline management plan. So in the context of the change we saw earlier, you know, what's happening? Are we in managed retreat mode? Are we holding the line? We can provide the management context for the change. So there's a lot of contextual layers in here that we're trying to make available actual geology and geomorphology rather. And so you can see we can do some work to tidy up the legends and so on, but you get the idea that what we're trying to do is show lots of different bits of information and make them very accessible. And I should say that for any individual layer, you should be able to pop up a little link and then be able to go to the source. So that's obviously getting at the metadata and the confidence in the data that Chris was talking about earlier. There's various other data sets as well. So we've got things like the flood zones, the flood zone 2 that was mentioned, I think, by one of the speakers from HR. We've got other products like coastal erosion, which is another BGS product. talking to the land use question, we've got the National Trust land use data for coastal areas, which is 2014 and 1965. And then we've also done some work on that to filter out the land lost identified from that system. So quite useful. And then equally things like habitat mapping and so on. So there's a huge amount in here. And then there's also multi-beam data for limited parts, again drawing directly in from the Channel Coastal Observatory. So if you want to look further offshore at the what's available in terms of data and what the situation is that's going on, then you can see further data from that. So there's a huge amount of potential to bring these sorts of data sets through to kind of understand what the coastal change picture is. And that equally, that would include, we don't have a legend for this one, but if we want to look at affected communities, then there's also things like the ability to pull in population data like this open pop grid, or ONS data as we heard earlier. So yeah, there's a lot there. So, but one of the things we mentioned was, in addition to just making the data available, you can provide pre-cooked data sets. But what happens if I want to kind of look at a bespoke area, my own area of interest? Well, we've also introduced in the demonstrator this idea of dynamic reporting. So you don't need to be an expert in coastal analysis to do this work. The idea is we've created some predefined reports. There's just 2 at the moment, but you could imagine there being several of these depending on the use case. And the idea is that we've brought in some historic coastline change information. We can click on the map to define an area of interest, and then it will automatically generate us a report. So this is a prototype, you've still got the placeholders, but you get the idea that this would automatically be inserting statistics. We get a dynamic map that updates, and down here you get metrics for the change of the different land use types, what's been lost and what's been gained, and then maps that cover that same area. And yeah, so the idea is to be able to run that, and just to prove it wasn't a spoof, you can have a play around with this, and you see how fast these results come back. So there's a huge amount of scope there. I think, as Chris says, the task now is to try and work out, what use cases are needing to be delivered, what sort of users are going to be using it. It's the same data sources, but we can deliver it at lots of different levels of technical detail. So some very, very technical, some more visual. And yeah, so that's the next phase that I think will need to be considered. But hopefully you'll all be able to have a play with this and come up with some ideas of what you'd like to see. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks for that. So I'm gonna hopefully stop sharing again. Too many screens open up. Where is this one? Like this. I'm gonna stop sharing now. We are getting now close to the question. We are actually on the question and answer session. So I'm gonna ask all the speakers online to switch on your cameras, if you don't mind. I'm gonna bring one more slide, which is actually me showing the questions that are kind of to break the ice, but I'm hoping that there is already questions coming through. So give me 1 sec. I'm going to share this screen. So can you see my screen? I hope you can. So I see a couple of questions. I think I counted 12 on the question and answer, but keep doing that. So now is when you have the chance to ask any questions to anybody on the team. By that, use the question and answer chat that you have on Zoom, and that's for the audience to ask any questions. Because you never know how engaged you're going to be on the question and answer. So I also ask all my speakers to kind of think about the 3 questions that you see written there. So it's what are the 3 key messages that you would like the audience to take away from today's event? And I'm looking at all the speakers to think about that. Where do you see the biggest challenge? Some of them has already been answered, to keep moving forward on what we're trying to do. If you have anything else you would like to share that you think we should be sharing and we haven't done so far. So, but without further ado, I'm gonna see all my speakers now on the screen. So thank you, James. Thank you, John, Paul. We also got Kyle and Lydia. I'm gonna kind of go through the questions one by one. So I'm gonna obvious the one that I shouldn't answer. Okay. Yeah, no much questions there. That's easy to answer. Okay, we got one. So that's one from Tim. I'm not sure. Can anybody from the panel? Can you read the question? Can you see the question on the screen as I'm going through? Okay, because I might misled you with my beautiful accent. But the team is asking many thanks for the project team and the sponsor for this immense effort of synthesis of the team. So for the rest of us, don't have to repeat it. And for summarizing it today. I have two questions and one comment. I certainly don't expect all of these to end. Oh, so sorry, I was reading the wrong one. So Tim, that's your first question. That's for you, James. Well, rather than me reading that, I'm gonna let you read that because it might be more a distraction.
Okay, so me or Tim, I'm happy to read it.
And please get close to your microphone because we can hear almost everybody really well, but you are really low.
Okay, the question is about coastline lengths. It was great to see tabulation of different coastal lengths reported, reminding us about fractals. Is it possible to recommend a scale at which the measurement ought to be reported? Or more likely, could national agreement be formulated by the standard scale, which we ought to use if the purpose of the assessment is to report coastal change using length of kilometers? I think that we do need to be careful about reporting things at a consistent scale. I'm not sure I'm in a position to demand that we report at one scale or another one. Obviously, the finer, the more detailed the scale, the better in a way. But when it comes to reporting, I think we do indeed need to pick out a standard scale, whether it's something like 1 to 10,000 or something like that. Otherwise, we're going to get different lengths. Alternatively, you report it as the percentage of lengths, because if different people are recording at different scales, at least a percentage change should be consistent between different areas. The second question was about terminology. I summarized the answer to the question of whether we have a national data set showing coastal infrastructure. I use the term sea defence. In an analysis, does this equate to defence which has only been put in place to deal with flooding rather than erosion? I think it partly comes back because the EA asset database was originally for flood defences and did not necessarily include defences to put there to deal with coastal erosion. It can be one or the other, depending. We don't necessarily know so much about private structures that have been put in place, particularly to deal with coastal erosion, whereas of nationally funded structures to deal with flooding are probably more carefully documented.
Thank you, James. And I'm moving now to the comment. And I think that the team mentioned either me, Chris, or Andy to tackle this one. So Chris and Andy are reading the question. If you want, Andy, Chris, please just come to the platform and speak at the microphone.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim. It's an interesting question. Yes, I mean, I think we are scratching the surface when we just look at the data. It's really the interpretation of the data or the analysis and then interpretation of the data. So it's this virtuous chain from sources of data to data that appears on the platform to information to then, decision support tools, I think. So, yeah, I think the development of indices, I think, helps us here. So when we abstract away from the raw data and the information to indices, I think can help deliver that sort of more functional basis that you're mentioning there. some of that can be done directly, dynamically, within the platform. Other stuff I think will be developed off the platform and then represented as a sort of static data, yet could still be dynamically reported.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, we have another product which helps identify new sites for vineyards, and within that there is expert level interpretation inserted in amongst the results based on criteria. So, you know, the land is suitable for certain types of grapes and under certain assumptions. So it is possible to kind of add some additional interpretation into the reporting, but at the moment, you know, obviously we're just taking facts and reporting them, but there's no reason why you couldn't do something similar in this context, as long as you've got the experts advising what that content should be. Thanks.
So moving down then, so we got a anonymous attendee. How do you see the portal evolving over time, and what do you see are the biggest commercial and societal opportunities of the program's output? I might be putting you on the spot, Lydia, but I think that's one more for Defra than for us. Are you happy to address that? Or Kyle?
Thank you. We haven't yet had a chance even to look at the findings and analyze that, but you know, we'll do that. And you know, I may not be able to answer that fully. Maybe we can come back to that at a later stage. I don't know if Kyle can add anything to that.
Yeah, it's something like Lydia suggested, it's something that's still being discussed now that this project has sort of come to a close. It's sort of the next step of naturally what we'd expect, and we need to put our heads together and figure it out. But I know we've discussed it, and in terms of the question below as well from Rob about the future plans, I know that this work links up quite well with the SMP refresh and the Explorer, and particularly NSERM 2, which is related to future coastal change. So we need to really have a discussion about where it would be hosted if this sort of thing went online, and if we could match up with those other projects and the sort of full scope of it in relation to what they're doing as well. So right now, like Lydia said, it's a bit early to say what might happen next, but there's a lot of things going on that could feed into this and that we could feed back into. So yeah, it's sort of a discussion that needs to be had now that this project has come to a close, essentially.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Kyle. I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is how can we access the coastline change data from IT? So that, unless I don't know the place in England or Wales.
No.
I don't think I can.
I mean the island of Haiti. In which
Oh,
case,
yes, that's a good point. Sorry, yes, James?
I presume that means the island of Haiti, but there are some worldwide assessments of coastal change derived using satellite data already. So that would cover at sort of 500-meter resolution for the Deltares one, coastal change from automatic shoreline detection and satellite images.
You know, thank you, James. Definitely, if Karen, if you're looking for global data sets, there are a few available. Another one is the coastal behavior from EMBOTnet. Well, sorry, that's European, but you got the Deltares one, as James mentioned. But this one is definitely not a global one. So moving next, I'm aware of time too, so I'm just for John, in a minute or two, I'm going to be asking you to wrap up. I forgot to say that I started late, so I have to apologize for me starting late, but I'm aiming to finish at 4. So the next question from Keith Nichols. How do you engage with the tool? For example, could Network Rail use this tool at different scale for the Cambria coast or for the stretch of the coast between example? So I'm going to pass the question to Andy probably.
My dad was born in Whitehaven, so that's personal to me. Yeah, in terms of at the moment, the data is only for those 2 areas, but there's no reason why you couldn't collect similar data and present it. In fact, a lot of it, if you actually look at the platform, there is already quite a lot of data that is taking the national cut. So there will be some data for Whitehaven already, but yeah, you would need to add that specific data in. And I guess that's kind of looking to the future, is that hopefully there would be a future project for a national coverage and more comprehensive tools.
So I think we will take one more question. It's the last one, actually, Paul.
Oh, Andreas, can I just jump in on that last one quickly? Just because it addresses something in the anonymous question that I didn't, which was what do you see the biggest commercial and societal opportunities? I think that links in with what we just said about Network Rail. I think the aim for this project, should we get a full map of the entire of England and Wales's coastline, is that it would be really beneficial to planning and housing and things like sort of infrastructure. So that would be the aim once we have all the data, for the entire coastline. That would be sort of the dream of why we would be doing it, I think.
No, yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Kyle. Paul, we're going to end the question and answer session with you, because you actually can phrase a question yourself. So I'm going to let you to ask that question.
Okay, yeah, just picking up on that final anonymous question. So we presented some numbers on the communities from coastal floodplain, because that was one of the ways the question was framed. But James also presented some information on coastal erosion, but also since we started NSERM 2, the National Coastal Erosion Risk Management process is out. I think it's actually out now. That does include some more erosion numbers. So, like, I guess all of the data that we're talking about in that first part, they will all continue to evolve that understanding. So certainly it does include erosion too.
Thank you, Paul. With that, actually, we finished the question and answer. And John, I'm going to pass just the word to you to just wrap up and close the event today, and you will have the last word.
Okay, thanks very much, Andres. Andres asked me to briefly say something about the success of the project and basically something about the future work, next steps, etc. In relation to where we are, I think we've got a very good assessment of the landscape, the challenges associated with the historical coastal change and how we put that into coastal modern coastal monitoring. What's interesting is to reflect on how the uncertainties have changed. It goes from very much epistemic uncertainties associated with incomplete knowledge, old data sets, etc., how we integrate those through to aleatory uncertainties associated with random phenomena. I think we've been on quite a journey. We are on quite a journey, and in fact, that's going to keep changing with coastal change in the future. In terms of next steps, I think what's been really good is we've developed the platform within this project, and really we've got to see how we can develop that and make sure that that's going to maintain its value. It's going to be maintain its openness, and it's good to get an open government license. But I think we want to look at how we can apply that most effectively. Just a few other things I think we need to think about now in terms of future work. One of the things which has been touched upon many times in this project and several of the presentations today was in the need for consistency. I think all of the speakers touched upon that, whether that's in definitions or approaches we're using and how we measure things. I think that's got to be something we work on collectively together. I think we've touched upon some of the problems in it. We're looking at exposure around the coast. And then I think we've got to move very much more into where we are in relation to vulnerability of the exposed assets and exposed communities, etc. And there's a massive piece of work, but I think that's obviously another big step we've got to take, and remembering that this is very hazard specific. I think we've got to look very much looking at the hazards themselves and how they integrate. And so it's never just coastal change is never caused just by one driver. It's caused by multiple drivers. And I think we've got to look at how those systems work together. Lastly, I think we've got to look at how we can ensure that we've got a much better view of coastal integration of the various systems in order to make sure that stakeholders, users, decision makers on the coast have open and ready access to all of the science and the data which is readily available. So there's just a few reflections, but my last few words is to say thanks very much to Natural Resources Wales, to Defra for funding the project. We hope we've achieved what you needed out of the project. To partner institutions, the contractor team, to the project board members, too many of you to mention, as also the project steering group. But in particular, I'd like to say it's a very big thank you to James, Paul, Vanessa, Chris, Andrew, and last but not least, Andres in presenting today. I think you've given a very good picture of the project altogether. And just to say thank you to all, and thank you to all for attending. I think this has been a good event, and I look forward to working with you and as a community in future years. So thank you very much, and thanks, and yeah, good. I hope you have a productive time on the coast in the future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and we close the meeting with that. Thank you all.